Good morning, Peaceful Valley Church. This is our second week in a row of doing Sunday school through YouTube. I'm recording this on Saturday. It's been a long day, but we're plugging along. I'm hoping that we're all going to be blessed by God's Word this morning. Last week, we introduced the idea of an Old Testament survey. We're just looking at the structure of the Scriptures, specifically the Old Testament. And last week, we looked at not only all the Old Testament and specifically Moses' writings, but specifically Genesis. And the structure that we see in that looks like an X, if you will, or maybe it's pointing at something in the middle. I didn't hear from anybody specifically, but I don't know if you've been thinking about the value of Leviticus in your own personal study. It's likely you didn't read Leviticus this week. That's okay. We should be reading our Bibles at some point in the Scriptures. So, we talked about Genesis, though, last week, and it's important for us to realize that in this structure, it's called a chiastic structure, they actually line up in this way. So even though we go Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, Genesis and Deuteronomy have a common theme. They line up with one another. There's also a common theme that lines up between Exodus and Numbers, and that's what we're going to study today. And in that connection, I'm hoping that we can see they're not the same story, but they are helping one another out in the story that they have to tell. And of course, the third wave of this is over in Leviticus, talking about what it means to be holy and in God's people. That's what this chiastic structure helps us to understand. So when I say that we're going to be studying Exodus and Numbers, there's actually a reason for that. They are connected thematically. Now, the theme connection between Genesis and Deuteronomy is actually the idea of covenant. And we didn't talk about that last week. So even though we're going to be talking about Exodus and Numbers, we have to start in Genesis talking about covenant. Now, covenant is an idea that we use today. Covenant is also an old thing, and we have to understand both what it is and what it isn't. Covenant is not a contract. We tend, in America, to think about important relationships using contract. If I'm going to do a job for somebody, there's a contract that's signed, I have responsibilities, there's a certain amount that I'm supposed to provide, the other person is supposed to provide whatever that, their side is. But if one side or the other of this contract backs out, the contract is ripped up. That's close to what a covenant is. It just misses the most important part. If there is covenant, it's not just two people making it, promising one another stuff and then they go their separate way. In covenant, there's a binding. It's not two separate people, it's one. They are uniting together. And in this union, one side has responsibility and the other side has responsibility. There's benefit and all that kind of stuff. But one of the most important words for us to understand in covenant is identity. For God to make covenant with Israel, there's identity issue there. They are now the people of God. He is now the God of Israel. They have been united and are now one. Different sides have different responsibilities. There's going to be blessings and cursings and promises and all kinds of stuff. But covenant is about identity, a defined relationship. And this is how God does things. Well, and actually, before we move on to that, we do have covenant still in our culture. And marriage is the primary one that we talk about. To where when a man and a woman, two separate entities, bind together, that union is not just two separate individuals with specific responsibilities who, when that's done, they're going to go their separate ways. It's not a marriage contract. It's a marriage covenant. Two separate people being united and bound together. They're now one entity. Each side has different responsibilities and there's blessings and all that stuff still exists. But when we're talking about covenant, we're talking about a union of identity. Okay. When we look at how God deals with mankind, He uses covenant. Why? We don't really know why, but we do know that when God created, he put some part of himself in that creation. For instance, God is a reasonable, logical, wise God. And when we look at the creation, he put that reasonableness and logic into the creation. Now we see a creation that functions. And it does so because it came from a God who is logical and reasonable and wise. In identity, this creation belongs to him. It's got a union with him. Mankind is the same. Man was created to be God's image and to bear his likeness. That means that mankind has this union with God. It's an identity level issue. It's a who I am, not just what I am. It's who I am. And so as we look at just the way that God does things, oh man, I don't know that I can say all of it, but so much of it has to do with identity, who you are. Now, the word that we use for that is covenant. Now, we have some explicit covenants that show up in Moses' writings. Now, if you're a guy who's into covenants, there's a couple more after the covenant through Moses that I didn't write down here. We have the Davidic covenant, that's the king covenant. And then there's this covenant with a high priest. And so that one's in there also. And then up on top, I've got one here in parentheses, the covenant with Adam. And it's maybe a covenant, it might not be. But we want to spend a little bit of time talking about these things. And I want to talk about Noah first, and then we'll go back to Adam. In the story of Noah, this is Genesis, it's early on. This is what the flood starts happening in chapter 6. The flood subsides in chapter 8. In chapter 9, we finally see this covenant. And actually, the end of chapter 8 is where Noah builds an altar and worships God there, and God promises that he'll never destroy the earth with a flood. That's the covenant promise. I'll never destroy the earth with a flood. That's chapter 8, verse 21. Okay? But he makes a comment in chapter 9, verse 8 that is what I want to get at. Then God said to Noah and his sons with him, "Behold, I establish my covenant with you and your offspring after you, and with every living creature that is with you, the birds, the livestock, and every beast of the earth with you, as many as have come out of the ark. It is for every beast of the earth. I establish my covenant with you that I will never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of the flood, and never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth." And God said, "This is the sign of the covenant that I make between me and you and every living creature that is with you for all generations. I have set my bow in the cloud, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. When I bring clouds over the earth and the bow is seen in the clouds, I will remember my covenant that is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh. And all the waters shall never again become a flood to destroy all flesh." When we see this covenant with Noah that God made, the covenant promise was, I'm never going to destroy the earth. And the reason is we need to be together. There's got to be a together, God and mankind. Right? I'm never going to destroy all earth with a flood ever again. And the sign of that promise is the rainbow. Okay? So with Noah, we have a sign promise, a sign of the promise. Sorry, I misspelled that. And that sign is the rainbow. By the way, that's a D. It's a tragedy in the world that we have today that the sign of the rainbow is communicating such ungodliness. God designed man, male and female, to be united to one another. And so as soon as we start messing with issues of gender and marriage, we're completely ruining God's design. And to take a ruined design and have the sign of that be a rainbow is a tragedy. That never should have happened. The rainbow is the sign of God's promise that he will never again destroy the earth with a flood. That means that and he uses this terminology, I'm going to look and see the rainbow and I'm going to remember, oh yeah, I promised to never destroy the earth with a flood. Now, is that actually how it happens? Or does God always keep himself set and himself accountable to his own promises? Yeah, I think that's actually what's going on there. But the rainbow is still there, not only for God to see it, but for us to see it. And for every single time you and I see a rainbow, we should be reminded God's not going to destroy us. But maybe something else to be reminded of. If you go back to chapter 8, verse 20, this is after they've come out of the ark. Then Noah built an altar to the Lord and took some of every clean animal and some of every clean bird and offered burnt offerings on the altar. And when the Lord smelled the pleasing aroma, the Lord said in his heart, I will never again curse the ground because of man. For the intention of man's heart is evil from his youth. You hear that? We might see the rainbow and we are excited that God's not going to destroy us. But the next thing we should remember is, but we deserve it. God's promised to not destroy us with a flood, but we deserve it. Okay, who is that promise to? Well, he actually explains it's for all the creation. All creation fits under this promise of God to never destroy the earth with a flood. That is pretty broad. Okay? From there, I want to talk about the promise that God made to Abraham. The promise that God made to Abraham. Now, if you remember back to last week, we talked about the genealogy or Toledot formula. That formula puts us at Genesis 11. We see Shem's descendants, and then we see the generations of Terah. Terah is the father of Abraham. So when we get into Genesis 12, the book has told us, all right, Abraham is the next dude we need to pay attention to. And Abraham is talked to by God. Abraham, this nobody from nowhere, is talked to by God, and God tells him, I'm going to make a covenant with you, I'm going to give you land, I'm going to make you into a great nation, and you're going to be a blessing to all nations. And the sign of that is circumcision. Okay? As long as the people recognize that and God recognizes that, they know they are in relationship together. God has made a covenant with Abraham. Is there any way for Noah to back out of his covenant? No. As long as there's a rainbow in the air, they're good to go. Is there any way for Abraham to back out of his covenant? Actually, no. God shows over and over through the rest of the scriptures that he is committed to Israel because he made promises to Abraham. And the sign of that he gave them is to remind them, we are the people of God. Now, Moses is a slightly different kind of covenant, so I don't want to go there yet. I actually want to go back to talk about Adam. God made Adam promises, and he gave Adam a law, and he had union with Adam. So what we see in God's relationship to Adam looks exactly like a covenant. It's just never actually called a covenant. So you might hear people talk of the Noahic covenant, the Abrahamic covenant, and the Adamic covenant. Realize these two are actually found and called covenants. The Adamic covenant is never called a covenant. But God's relationship with Adam in basically every way looks just like a covenant. So I personally believe that there is such a thing as the Adamic covenant. It's just never called that in the scripture. So now we can move back down to Moses. And getting to Moses allows us to move into Exodus and Numbers. When we look at the covenant that God made with Israel through Moses, we're talking about, and this is probably oversimplification, we're talking about the Ten Commandments. Okay, the Ten Commandments, there's probably just one M in there, isn't there? The Ten Commandments are God's law that he gave Israel so that they would know how to be the people of God. Now, where Noah and Abraham couldn't back out of that covenant, they were going to be blessed by it no matter what. The covenant with Israel through Moses was what's called a conditional covenant. The other ones are unconditional. This is a conditional covenant. God would continue doing the things he promised he would do as long as they would fulfill their responsibilities. This covenant that united Israel with God has responsibilities on the part of the Israelites. Unfortunately for the Israelites, they proved generation after generation they were unable to fulfill or follow those laws. In fact, all the way into Jesus' ministry and the writings of, in Acts, the writings of Paul, Peter, everybody else, everybody's admitting nobody can follow this law. But God has done something better. He's made a new covenant in Jesus Christ, and it has made the old covenant obsolete. The new covenant has replaced it, and so now we're made right in Jesus Christ rather than trying to fulfill these laws. And yet, these 10 commandments that we see, God didn't just choose them out of nowhere. God actually wants us to live lives that follow the 10 commandments. Not because following the 10 commandments makes us right, but because God wrote those down because that's who he wants people to be. He just told us in the 10 commandments. So, do we have to follow the 10 commandments today? No. But a person who is saved will. Okay. With these covenants, God making relationship to mankind in different places, we see a narrowing. In Adam, and then we've got the Noahic covenant for all creation, and then the Abrahamic covenant for just the children of Abraham, and then the Mosaic covenant, just the people who are going to be obedient. And so with that narrowing, we find that God is still aiming at something. And that brings up the word that we brought up last week, seed. This is protecting and providing the seed of the woman who will eventually crush the serpent's head. All right, so when was this covenant given? Answer, in Exodus. So there we are. We finally made it to Exodus. And so now we can start talking about Exodus. Now, in your English Bibles, nearly all of them will have the title Exodus, which the word Exodus just means to exit out of something or escape or to be brought out. You may remember, though, from last week, all of the writings of Moses are one scroll. This is a really long scroll. And so the Israelites divided it into 5 sections. And each section's title is just the first words of that book. So the title of Exodus is, these are the names. Now in Hebrew that's only 2 words, and these are the names is the name of Exodus in the Hebrew Bible. Now, if you hear a list like the names of, now that's not exactly a Toledah, that's not exactly a genealogy, but we're still kind of talking about the same thing, aren't we? Remember that Toledah formula that Moses used so much in Genesis? It kind of continues into Exodus. We're going to talk about a specific group of people who are now in Egypt. Why are they in Egypt? Well, you're going to have to read the end of Genesis to answer that question. They are in Egypt here, though. The first chapter covers really just its own timeline. In chapter 2, we get, now a man from the house of Levi went and took his wife, a Levite woman. Their son is Moses. Moses will be stuck in this situation as an infant where his parents have to save him from a wicked Pharaoh who makes this law to kill all the infant boys. He's eventually brought up out of the river, and he's raised in Pharaoh's household by Pharaoh's daughter, and when he's 40 years old, he ends up running away from Egypt. His people reject him, the Egyptians reject him, everybody rejects him, and he runs away. Chapter 3, he speaks to this bush that is on fire, but it doesn't burn, and it's God telling him, you need to go back and set my people free. It's super important for us to note the issue of holiness in Exodus. Holiness was not really a big deal in Genesis. God was just gathering his people. But, hey, Moses, come to me, and by the way, you have to take off your sandals because the ground you're standing on is holy. Why is it holy? Because the ground is holy? No, because God is there. So it calls us to recognize when God is going to make union, covenant with his people, there's an expectation that in his presence, holiness must be found. So when Moses walks up to the burning bush, he doesn't just walk up flippantly. No, we're talking about holiness in the presence of God. Throughout Exodus, we see the issue of holiness being brought up over and over and over and over and over. When he redeems these people, he's going to make them his people, not just random people. They're not going to be whoever they want. So, here's the bush. God's sending Moses in. He's supposed to go and find these people, and then he's going to lead them out. And then you get chapters of these plagues. Essentially, the plagues are God exerting his power against false gods. Now, it's vitally important for us to catch this. God doesn't tell the Egyptians those aren't gods. The frogs and the sun and the moon and the stars and the flies and the Nile and all. He doesn't say those aren't gods. Instead, you should worship me. He lets them believe that those things are gods. He lets their hearts believe those things are gods. And over the 10 plagues, he's proving he's more powerful than those gods. Kind of makes you wonder what he's allowing you to believe. What he's allowing you to trust as though it's a god. Because there's going to be a time when he's going to overpower that thing that you're trusting, and he's going to prove he's a bigger God than what you're trusting. May we all just give up those gods on our own first. But the plagues and all that kind of stuff, and right here is where we stop and we ask the question, who's the original audience of Exodus? And the answer is the Israelites who are about to cross the Jordan River to go into the Promised Land. They've been wandering in the wilderness for 40 years under the direction of Moses. They've been wandering and getting destroyed. And we know from the book of Numbers that they left with over 600,000 fighting men. And somehow, when they're ready to go into the Promised Land, they still have 600,000 fighting men. So even though God destroyed all the faithless in Israel, which was all of them except Moses, Joshua, and Caleb, even though he wiped out everybody, he still has the same number of people to go into the Promised Land. That's a pretty amazing way of purifying the people and preserving them. But what I'm getting at here is Exodus 4 is about the people who are standing on the plains of Moab. If you were younger than fighting age, let's say 20, if you were younger than the age of 20, when you left Egypt, you got to go into the Promised Land. A portion of the people who are on the plains of Moab, listening to Moses tell this story that had happened earlier, they're not hearing it as though they've never heard it before. They're hearing it and they're remembering it. They were there. They were raised in Egypt. So from this point on, we have to recognize that the original audience listening to this story lived this story. It's one of the evidences that we know that Moses' writing is true, because the original audience accepted it. If they hadn't accepted it, right, well, let me put it another way. If he was wrong, if he told these stories wrong, they wouldn't have accepted it because they were there. Eyewitnesses. And they're accepting this testimony. The writings of Moses are totally trustworthy, even just based on that one fact. So, he's writing to them, and he's telling them and reminding them of all the things that God has done. And by the time we get, halfway through Exodus, we see that he has brought the people out. Chapter 14 is crossing the Red Sea, and chapter 15 is Moses' psalm, which enters us into God beginning to provide for his people in the wilderness. Bread from heaven, the quail. He takes them to the mountain and gives them the law. The second half of the book of Exodus is about what it takes to be the people of God. And what we need to understand in that connection there, where we go from exiting Egypt to being in the wilderness and trying to be Israel, the people of God, in that changeover, there's still something hanging. And let me explain when I say something hanging. When we see this chiastic structure of Moses' writings, the big issue of Exodus and Numbers is redemption. The idea of God doing something to make Israel his own. And in the beginning of Exodus, he does some physical things to make them physically his. The water physically turned to blood. The flies physically were there, and the frogs physically, and all this stuff. The plague of the firstborn son. Those children physically died. God physically brought Israel out of Egypt and physically through the Red Sea. All this physical slavery stuff or physical redemption stuff. And yet the issue of the enslavement of their hearts is left hanging. You see, and I know this is hard to see. I probably should have changed the color on this. This green word says ransom, and this green word says purification. When we look at the relationship between Exodus and Numbers, Exodus is redeeming and ransoming Israel physically and setting them up to be the people of God. But when we get to Numbers, they prove their hearts are still enslaved to Egypt. They still need purified, and again, this word here says purification. In order for God to truly redeem them, they need purified of their idolatry. Purified of their idolatry. That's the relationship between Exodus and Numbers, and they play that role together because of the structure that Moses uses to write this. But in Numbers, though they've been physically set free, their heart yearns to be back in Egypt. It yearns to be back at the meat pots. It yearns to be back. But what we see is God killing them off. They were a faithless people. And in order to purify them and make them truly his, to fully and completely redeem them, he had to get rid of the faithless generation. And we see all of that take place. Numbers is a hard book to read. So, we have that issue. But even then, it calls us to ask ourselves the question of, back in Exodus chapter 20, were the Israelites better off having a covenant with God? Were they better off being his chosen people? Were they better off having the Ten Commandments? Because in Numbers, they showed that they didn't think they were better off. We would have been better off if we just stayed in Egypt. We'd rather be slaves in Egypt than die in the wilderness. You know, that question hits even Christians. That's why Paul uses phrases like count the cost. Okay? When we have God open our eyes to truth, and he shows us what the Christian life is supposed to look like, and he tells us to love our neighbors and to consider others as more significant than ourselves, and to work for the betterment of those around us, sometimes we look at that and we say, I'd rather not do that. But the connection of Exodus and Numbers is a painful one. Not only painful to read, painful to apply. When we are going about our life, do we honestly believe that we're better off being a Christian? Or do we secretly still have those desires to just go out and do all the sinful things that the world is doing? We have to be able to know it's better to be in covenant relationship with God. It's better. We are better off out of slavery and redeemed. We are better off out of idolatry and purified. We're better off with those things. Now, this will lead to the book of Leviticus, because if we're going to be convinced that we're better off redeemed and ransomed and purified, if we're better off that way, then understanding what a holy life is becomes that much more important. So, I just want to give us some hints about what we're going to find in Leviticus. One of the first things we're going to see is a lot of the stuff from the end of Exodus is just going to be copied in Leviticus. And often when you read them, you're thinking, why did Moses just duplicate all of these things? You're also going to find that Leviticus is kind of long. Like all these rules and laws, why does it just keep going on forever? And what I want to get at here is there's no such thing as the sacred life separate from the secular life. There's no such difference between the Christian life and just kind of everyday life. If you're a Christian, there's only Christian life. Whether you're at work or with your kids or at church or whatever it is that you're doing, you do that as a Christian. And you see that when you see all of the stuff that Exodus and Leviticus put together to show us what a holy life looks like. I mean, it even goes to the point of saying you have to build like a short stub wall around the roof of your house, because they used to walk on the roofs of their houses. You had to, that was part of the law. You had to build this wall around the roof of your house. That way, nobody would fall off the roof and get hurt. If God's going to make laws like that to describe what a holy people look like, if he's going to go to building instructions, you got to know he cares about every part of your life. For you people still in school, middle school, high school, college, your work in your studies should be defined primarily as being a heart and a mind of a Christian. Hardworking, diligent, compassionate, wanting to flourish, wanting to succeed, wanting God to receive the glory and not me, wanting to benefit those around me, and wanting to work in this life in such a way as everyone around me is benefited. If you're talking about retirement, there's no such thing as walking away from godliness or walking away from diligence. If you're talking about getting married, if you're talking about getting a job, buying a house, buying a car, all of those decisions are decisions made by Christians, and therefore they fall under the category of the sacred. All of those decisions are sacred. Now we don't follow the law as though following the law makes us holy or makes us acceptable to God. For the Christian, you are only acceptable to God in Jesus Christ. You're only made truly holy by Christ himself, and yet he then calls you to walk a life of holiness. And the Israelites actually kind of understood that because Leviticus was so important to them. What I want you to know is the broad topics that Exodus and Leviticus bring up about the holy life should help you to understand that there is no part of your life that falls outside the bounds of an expectation for holiness. Why? Because you're the people of God. That's a high standard. So, just to wrap up, I hope you were able to ponder the connection between Exodus and Numbers. And you might even see this in your own life. You might look at your old life and you see maybe you lived in a bad house or in a bad neighborhood, or you're involved with a bad group. And you got out of those bad places physically. Did you free your heart up from those sinful things as well? You might have gotten out of the bad household, but is your heart still devoted to the things that bad household wanted? Those are some deep questions. And Moses is pushing us toward those questions in his writings. And we should be able to apply that stuff to our hearts even today. So may God be with us as he is showing us those places where he's calling us to holiness and calling us to be purified of our sins. Let's pray. Lord God, you have taken care of us and you have seen fit to in this season, keep us home. So right now, I pray that we'll be taking this time to have some rest and to be growing and to be filling our minds with truth. And so that when we are together again, we would be together more unified and more devoted to seeing one another grow and mature. And I pray in Jesus' name, amen.